You're listening to Retro Reels, a show that looks back on films from time gone by and recalls the various events, trends, and perspectives that inform their creation. I'm your host, Hanna, here to guide you through a trip to the past via the silver screen. Thanks for joining me today on the debut episode of Retro Reels. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to explore some classic and some not so classic, but still technically vintage, i.e. over 15 years old, movies with you every week. There's no shortage of things to talk about when it comes to movies, especially when you look at the cultural and historical context in which they were made, and especially when you're a big nerd like me. Time keeps moving forward, and the world and the way we see it continuously changes, so the movies made during a given time often leave behind a compelling snapshot of the way things used to be. Just as a little behind-the-scenes detail, this is actually my second time recording my first program, because the first time I sounded awkward. I've only recorded with other people so far, and when you're talking to someone, it's a lot more natural. And when you're not talking to someone, you end up sounding a little funny, or at least I did. So what I did to solve this problem was I grabbed one of my stuffed animals from home and I set it up next to me here in the studio so that I could talk to someone. And I think that's helping. I think it's making me sound a little bit more natural, or I would hope so. I might just keep him here, and he can just be my little buddy while I record forevermore. Okay, episode 1. So I had a really hard time actually trying to decide what to start with. A lot of the movies that I want to cover on my program, I've seen them before, some of them multiple times. And I always watch them again before writing about them so that they're fresh on my mind. So when faced with the prospect of where to start, I was stuck. There were weeks I really racked my brain. I wasn't sure what to cover first. I was talking it over with my husband, Aaron, who I should say he should probably technically be considered the invisible co-host of this show, since he watches all the movies with me and talks about them with me. And he started firing off some suggestions to me from our collection, from the streaming services we use, and just from memory, all the things that we have seen before. But I shot them all down for different reasons, like not wanting to start with a favorite before I have a chance to get better at writing and recording my program, and not wanting to start with a popcorn movie that's too entertainment focused and just doesn't give me enough meat to talk about. And on the flip side of that, not wanting to start with a really complex, inaccessible movie that would make everyone think I'm a snob. I mean, I would kind of be lying if I said I wasn't a bit of a snob, but that's just not the impression that I want to give right away. Broadly, for this program, my intent is to cover a wide variety of old movies, not just ones that are critically acclaimed or considered culturally significant, but also ones that are just fun to watch. It's a movie. And they have nothing in particular to teach you, impart to you, or impress upon you emotionally. This being the first episode, I think it's also appropriate to provide a little bit of background information about why I love movies so much, enough to dedicate hours of my time to watching and writing and talking about them every week. I mentioned my husband is my unofficial invisible co-host, but my parents are just as relevant, really even more so in terms of the overall development of my taste in movies and how I watch them. Between the two of them, I would guess they've probably watched close to, 8 to 10,000 movies throughout their lives, maybe. It's a very generous estimate, but they've been watching movies pretty much for their entire lives. And they're the reason that I've seen so many myself, especially older movies. In fact, it was watching movies imported to Taiwan from Hollywood that first planted the idea of going to America in my mother's mind. So, in a way, you could say that I might not exist at all if it weren't for movies. And not only were they a huge part of the environment I grew up in, but so was film criticism and review. We had a lot of books in my house, and a fair few of them were collections of reviews by really great and insightful writers like Pauline Kael, Roger Ebert, and Susan Sontag. So even though my parents never explicitly pushed me to look at movies with a critical eye, it's not like we watched something and then they interrogated me about what I thought about a movie or anything like that. I think if they had done that, I probably wouldn't enjoy watching them. But it was just the fact of being consistently exposed to old and interesting and challenging movies and reading the ideas of really smart people who watched them that educated me. I did take a couple of film theory courses in college just for fun, but for the most part, it was this upbringing that shaped the way I consume media today. I mentioned that I could be called a bit of a snob, but that's not really true. I've just seen a lot of stuff, and it's made me very picky. It would be a lot more fair to say that I have certain expectations and a never-ending stream of opinions that I love to share. So, with all of that said, what I've decided to go with this week is a classic Jackie Chan movie. It's called Police Story. It was first released in 1985, and I'll also mention its sequel, Police Story 2, which was released 3 years later. Chan directed and starred in both of these movies. So, Jackie Chan. You can't really talk about his movies without mentioning a little bit about him. Public opinion on Chan is quite varied, I think, depending on who you talk to, especially here in Taiwan and in his hometown of Hong Kong, because his politics took a turn in the late 90s, and many might say his views have gradually become more extreme as decades have gone by. I certainly would say that, but I don't want to wade too deep into that. So I'll just say that before around 1997, when he worked on Police Story 1 and 2 in the 80s, he was still quite young, and he was in the prime of his career as an actor and a stuntman, and he hadn't yet given Taiwanese audiences a reason to have complicated feelings about him. Chan himself actually considers Police Story his best action film, and this opinion is validated by the fact that it's frequently included in lists of the greatest action films of all time. It wasn't the movie that introduced him to American audiences like he hoped it would be, but it did help to cement his stardom throughout Asia broadly. No matter what your personal opinion of Jackie Chan is, Police Story is without a doubt a first-class action movie, notable for featuring some of the most jaw-dropping practical stunts ever filmed, many of which put the stuntmen in serious physical danger again and again and again. When I watched it, I thought to myself, well, there's no way any of this could be done in today's filmmaking climate, especially not in the United States, where they have unions and labor laws and other inconveniences to the Chinese work ethic. Of course, being a stuntman is still very dangerous work today, and people still get permanently injured, some even die. But it was even more lawless and less controlled in the 80s. Watching Police Story, you get the sense that it was almost a free-for-all, and people seemed willing to offer up their lives just to get the shot. If you have a look at the behind-the-scenes footage of the movie, Jackie Chan and other members of his crew are regularly filmed looking dazed, dizzy, some maybe on the verge of passing out, and they're being fanned and toweled off by medics and other cast members. It looks like Crazy Town. It really does. But everyone is so committed to the cause, and you can see that too. They really put blood, sweat, and tears into it. Before I continue, let's have a listen to some of the theme song for Police Story. It's a song called The Hero Story, and it's actually sung by Jackie Chan himself.
追尋大意義，生命作賭注，留下了英雄故事，憂患見骨氣，昂步顧盼似醒獅，衝前去，全部得失只有全心知，跨步上雲上我要去寫明知。
Very, very 80s, catastrophically 80s, I might say. I wasn't alive during the 80s. I was born in the 90s, but it's a very identifiable sound. So I watched both of the original Police Story movies for the first time last summer, one right after the other, and the impression I came away with was that they're so much fun, it's unbelievable. I'm not really an action film junkie. It's not really my genre. I don't go out of my way to watch, the latest installment of Mission Impossible. But I do think that the amount of fun a viewer has while watching an action movie is really the defining feature of the genre. As in, if you're not having fun, then they're probably doing something wrong. The whole point of thrilling car chase scenes and fight scenes is to get your adrenaline going, get you excited watching it. So if they're not doing that, it's just not a good action movie. Police Story starts off in this shanty town that seems to be placed on the side of a hill just by a freeway, where Jackie Chan as Sergeant Kakui is taking part in a sting operation to catch the big bad guy, Chu Tao. By the end of the first scene, the whole shantytown set piece has come crashing down, and you witness this car chase that involves two actors actually crashing through a windshield and tumbling to the asphalt from the top of a double-decker bus, those buses that have two levels to them. So they're pretty high off the ground. It turns out Chan never actually intended for that to occur during the stunt, but he took advantage of it. He stayed in character. He kept the camera rolling for the sake of getting the shot. And then he rushed to check on his crew members right after the cut. This is the first of many scenes that will have you wincing at the extent of the physical abuse the actors were willing to put themselves through. In fact, as the movie goes on, you get the sense that the whole thing is not much more than the sum of its stunts. The plot amounts to a pretty basic cop story about nailing the criminal. Initially, Chan's character becomes something of a cop hero for being able to corner Chu Tao in that first sting operation. But even though they managed to arrest him, a series of mishaps that involve Chu Tao's girlfriend and the police's key witness results in a lack of evidence needed to actually put him in jail. And once he gets out, he, of course, has a thirst for vengeance against the cop who outsmarted him. His henchmen bait Kakui into a trap. They frame him for the murder of another cop. And in the latter half of the movie, his character undergoes kind of a strange shift. He gets a little bit crazed and desperate in his attempt to clear his name. Ultimately, though, he does catch Chu Tao, he proves his innocence, and he gets reinstated into the police force. Happy ending. So it's a pretty standard and largely predictable story, and Chan actually admitted in interviews about the movie that when he wrote the script, he was really just trying to weave a story into a list of stunts and the locations for them that he had envisioned. So the plot was literally an afterthought. It was a convenient skeleton for all of the action to be placed upon. In the first half, there's also a few funny jokes and setups for physical comedy, some of which are literally like pure clownery, right down to pie-in-the-face kind of gags. But mainly, you're just waiting to see the next series of hazards that Chan puts himself and his crew through. In Police Story 2, Chan actually applied the criticism he received about the first movie, and he put more effort into the plot. But ironically, this ends up being to the detriment of the quality of the sequel. So even though he got a bigger budget, he got nicer props, he wrote a longer, more involved story, as you're watching it and as time ticks by without a fight scene or, something happening, you find yourself wishing everyone would just shut up and break more panes of sugar glass. It is worth noting that Maggie Cheung gets more screen time in the second movie. In the first movie, she's really not much more than another prop. But in the second movie, she's a lot more fleshed out in her role as Kakui's girlfriend. And she did her fair share of stunts. She bled for this movie. You can see in the blooper reel that runs over the credits for the movie that she actually busted the top of her head open doing a stunt in the last scene, which took place in a factory. But even though the sequel has its moments, there's no denying it's much slower, it's less exciting compared to the first one. It just goes back to what I said about fun had as the main determinant of a good action movie. Police Story 2 is just not as fun to watch. I guess the lesson to be learned here is an action movie's story only needs to be just good enough to serve as the framework for a bunch of action. Regardless, Chan is really such a star in both of these films. He has so much charisma. He really knows how to make you like watching him. And no matter what he's doing, he's showcasing this gymnast level of control he has over his body. And he's using this ability every second he's on camera to pull off these fight scenes that are as athletic as they are ridiculous. I found it interesting that the first English language reviews of Police Story initially criticized this aspect of his acting. They called it too slapstick to take seriously. In one review by film critic Vincent Canby, written in 1987, he said the film was actually funnier for how silly it sounded dubbed in English than it was for the physical humor. Now, there have been whole parody movies and skits made in more recent decades that make the whole gag out of just how ridiculous the English dub of Chinese movies tends to be, when that's not even really the fault or the intention of the original Chinese filmmaker. It just sounds like a cheap shot to me when you could watch the one with subtitles and just read it instead of sitting through the goofiness of the dub. So it's pretty interesting to me that Canby thought it was fair game to make fun of this aspect, and the New York Times saw fit to print that. He even went so far as to call the movie ultimately not much more than a souvenir of another culture, which is really quite an offensive thing to say. Altogether, the review reads very much like a case of white guy who chuckles derisively at foreigners. But that's kind of just how things used to be, and that's a sentiment I'll probably return to quite a lot over the course of this program. It is worth mentioning, though, that later reviews walked back on this, and when Americans were finally ready to admit that Jackie Chan was great, he got the recognition he deserved. That's all I have for you guys today. I'm Hanna Belinsky. Thank you for tuning in to Retro Reels, and I hope you'll join me again next time on another look back on the way things were.